Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. Hope you're having a nice time. Hopefully it continues after the presentation. Today I will be talking to you about testing requirements and a few words about myself first. As already mentioned, my name is Anton Rodzevich. I've been working for some time with DevExperts, and I consider myself a bit, well, humbly, quite interested in requirement analysis as part of my main responsibility, sort of engineering. And today I want to talk to you about why I think it's important. Specifically, we will talk about, during the presentation, about why it's important, in my opinion, to review requirements. What are the benefits of review? We will also take a look at how to better organize the process of review for those already familiar or looking to establish this process from the ground up. And of course, we will take a look at how to actually analyze the requirements with no experience, having no experience with any subject area or having some subject matter expertise. I want to preface this by saying that, of course, in like 20 minutes, I cannot really teach you how to do this. So consider this more like a, food for thought, right? Just a kind of like a mind experiment. So without further ado, let's start with just talking a bit about why it's important to have requirements in the first place and why it's important to do the review. Whichever requirements you consider, whether it's small like user stories or whether it's like huge documents, technical documentations, or design documents, they all serve the same purpose. They allow us to compare the implementation that we have with the client requests. And considering that all of us try to kind of do shift lefting and trying to minimize the amount of issues that come to production, what we want to do is we want to prevent, right? And the prevention of mistakes is always cheaper than correction. So because of this, requirement analysis becomes kind of a cornerstone in the whole process of minimizing the amount of time we dedicate to kind of rolling out into production. Now, some of you might ask yourself a question: why should I care about reading the requirements? And I know that some of you might not be from QA here today, so I will present to you not only the perspective of QA, but also the perspective of all members of R&D and why it might be important for everyone present. We'll start with QA. The benefits are quite obvious, in my opinion. Obviously, if you think about the requirement first, it kind of optimizes your test coverage because you think about the requirements, you think about what you're going to kind of write in test cases, and that simplifies things. Additionally, it minimizes the amount of issues you're going to find during dynamic testing because, of course, if you read the document, you're going to prevent something, thus minimizing the amount of bureaucracy you're going to create for yourself by creating defect reports. And sure enough, it also helps you to actually communicate the risks better to the stakeholders and all parties involved in the process of deploying software. As for everyone else, and mainly for developers, review kind of validates logic nodes, so you kind of understand what's the functionality you're going to look at, how it works, what does it mean specifically. It also reduces kind of necessity for revision of code, because of course, if you read the requirements, it creates less tension when you actually write the code itself. And most importantly, in my opinion, not only for developers, but for everyone in R&D, it kind of helps you align your understanding of requirements with everyone else. And it's really underrated sometimes because you have a lot of questions from QA, from business analysts, all the people talk about the requirements, you don't really know what's going on. And if you read questions from other people, you start to realize, okay, maybe I've not seen certain things in the requirement. Maybe I should look at it from a different angle. So this kind of it. Now, before we continue with how to actually do the review, let's talk quickly about how to organize it. And I understand that for every process, for every company, it's different. So I cannot really give you like a single solution to all of your problems. But I have some suggestions, some hints, I guess. First, I suggest that you take a look at the requirements that you have as a separate small features rather than a whole document in the single go. Especially if you have a huge part of documentation written as like technical docs, huge documents rather than small user stories. You can also separate processes if necessary. This might probably be most valuable to QA. Usually when you create testing documentation, you do the requirement in parallel. So it doesn't really have to be this way. You can segregate the processes if necessary. You can do the review first, then the analysis, the test coverage later. It's also, in my opinion, very important to involve business analysts into the process, no matter how funny it might sound, because sometimes it's very easy to kind of not explain to people that are responsible for requirements how exactly this is done in terms of how the process is organized. So you probably just want to explain this a bit better to them. And it's extremely important, and this is the whole reason why we do the review, is to update the stakeholders on the status of it. So people need to understand at which specific point we are in development, what parts of documents have been analyzed, what we have still to do, and stuff like that. And I know it raises more questions than I probably have answered, but I also have like a short FAQ before we switch to the question section at the end, which to my mind come first. First question is most important, is what do I do if there's no business analyst present? And to my understanding, the answer to this is that you probably want to find a single point of entry into the requirement. So if you don't have a business analyst present, you can designate a single person, most responsible probably person in your team, to at least gather all the feedback and reduce the amount of chaos you produce, you as a team, I mean. So this is probably one of the ways to address this. And another thing is that how do I actually ask questions properly? And clear communication is extremely important. And in my opinion, it kind of consists of 3 points. First point is that it should have a clear assignee. So a person needs to know that something is addressed to him or to her. The second point is that your comment or your kind of the way you address person should understand what he or she needs to do specifically. And third, it should be documented. So I don't recommend using Slack or other chat applications to communicate. Probably inbuilt tools like Jira, for example, if you're using a tracking system, is going to be a better idea. So yeah, kind of like that. So without talking about how to actually build the process, we have talked about some theory behind this, but how to actually build this. There are, of course, multiple tools, and I, of course, suggest using current generation tracking systems, especially if it's allowed in your company or if you have this availability. For example, in Jira, you can use either inbuilt tools for your tracking system or consider different plugins. There are a lot of different nice things in Jira, like structures, labels, quick filters. You can use all of that to build a process of actually kind of maintaining at which stage the review is. You probably want to accommodate for different states of questions and answers, as already mentioned, because people from business analysis departments are going to look at these questions and try to answer them for you. So you want to make sure at which stage the questions are. And finally, my final advice for this is not to overcomplicate unless absolutely necessary, because the more bureaucracy, the less chance people are going to actually follow up with the process and probably going to neglect them if it's too complicated. So whichever method you prefer, with whichever tool you use, you probably want to make it minimalistic, as clean and as clear as possible. Now, finally, we're getting to actually reviewing the requirements, and this is a bit problematic due to multiple reasons. First reason is that requirements analysis is context dependent. It's really necessary to understand where exactly you stand and what exactly you want to accomplish. And in my opinion, you want to probably start with 3 main questions before you actually begin the analysis. First, you want to understand if you have the experience with the business area. This is going to come in handy when you select which tools and methods you're going to use. And another thing is that you want to understand if you only have a technical document or if you have some kind of visual reference available to you. Because we're going to work from the assumption that you don't have any implementation available to you whatsoever, so you only have a document present. I mean, in the following parts of the presentation, we're only going to work from this assumption, that you don't really have any implementation available and only a document. In this case, visual reference can serve as some kind of help, and we will see how exactly this can be accomplished. Finally, if you have enough information to actually start the analysis, maybe the requirement is not yet in the final state. Maybe it's a draft. Maybe the client doesn't really know what they want. So you probably want to confirm first before you actually begin not to do the work that might not be necessary at the moment. Finally, I just want to say, in all my years at DevExperts, I have interviewed a lot of people for the position of QA, and I have asked all of them the question of how they do the review. of requirements, and if they do it in the first place. And a lot of the time, people come to me and they say, okay, yeah, I do the review. And I ask them, how do you do this specifically? And they say something like, well, I read the documents. I make sure that I understand it. And I ask, what do you do if there's no context available to you? They say, I come to my colleagues, to my seniors, and I ask them to give me the context. Well, sometimes it's not possible. So my main thing that I want to kind of communicate tonight is that clear enunciation of results is extremely important. You should work on the ability to actually say what you have specifically done with the analysis, and I'm going to give you some tools and some ideas on what you can actually do and what you can accomplish in the next slides. So just keep this in mind. It's really important. We will start with no experience whatsoever, right? If you don't have any experience, if you don't know what to do in terms of, I mean, specifically subject area, but you know something about software development, you can always start with, for example, formal criteria. ISTQB mentions in their syllabus main criteria as 4 main criteria: completeness, correctness, readability, and consistency. And in summary, all it means is that the document should provide sufficient explanation on an adequate level of abstraction. It shouldn't be too abstract or too specific, on the contrary. It should follow a coherent logic. There should be no contradictions. It's easy to read and especially navigate the document that you're reviewing, and it should be consistent with the rest of the documentation, especially if you have it. But as you can probably guess, and if you have already seen, I have specifically omitted testability. I just want to kind of pinpoint this specifically for just a minute. For those of you who work for QA or plan to work for QA, just please memorize this, that no one is going to care about testability apart from you. I'm telling you this from experience, and this is extremely important, because if you don't know how you're going to test a document, someone will come to you and say, why did you greenlight it? If, for example, a developer and a business analyst and who knows who else is going to confirm that the requirement can be implemented and you greenlight it, but you don't know how to test it, when something bad happens, you're going to be responsible for it. So make sure that you know how to test the document, and at least in theory. Now this one is going to be scary a bit in the next slide. So you'll see a formula here, and without any experience, you can still probably work with general data logic. And I will demonstrate how with a few simple logical questions, you can probably dissect this formula and make it a bit easier for you to understand. So the first thing you can ask is whether it makes sense at all in the first place. So here in this formula, you see several functions, and the first function you see is the sum function. So we want to sum something up. But as you can probably see, the only thing that we can sum up is the single arguments, which is an if statement, which doesn't make a lot of sense. We can probably omit sum from this example, and this already gives us some room to improve. We can also think about data types. We want to understand if what's the how the final computation is going to look like, whether it's going to be like a float number, an integer number, if it's going to be placed in a string, maybe, even if it's a number, something like that. So you want to know about data types that are going to be presented as a result of the computation. We probably want to know about rounding rules, and especially if you work with money or with applications that work with money, because even small change, you're not going to be pleasantly surprised by this fact if someone messes up with your money. So always keep in mind when working with formulas that there are different types of rounding, like mathematical rounding, floor rounding, ceiling rounding, different types. Another question, if there's any reference to variables. This is important. I may not know what historical.average fill price is, but business analyst probably does know. So if you don't see any kind of reference or any explanation to what the value is, you probably can request this. It's common knowledge. Another thing is that formatting can be different for UI and backend sides. Maybe in the backend you want to store this as with a specific precision, with like maybe 5 digits, but in the UI you want to show a value with only 2-digit precision, something like that. Different value types are also most of the time are omitted in the documentation. It's not really talked about whether we want to support negative values, 0 values, not a number values, null values, and different types of values besides positives. And the final question I can present to you is whether the result is going to be static or dynamic. right? If you're going to only store the value present, it's one thing. But if you're going to update this on the fly in the application, it's going to be a bit of a different thing. So you probably want to ask a question like this to the analyst. And as you can see, with just these questions, of course, there are a lot more questions, but this formula doesn't really become that scary. If you don't really even understand what's going on, you can still probably come up with some problems that you can find with this piece of logic. Another thing that I mentioned is that any visual reference is going to be a plus. So whenever you have a visual reference, it almost serves as a sort of implementation for you. You can also apply testing techniques that you usually do when you create testing coverage. For example, in this specific case, we can probably think about different testing techniques, like maybe state transition, for instance. We can probably add a new table and see how it's actually going to look like if I add a new table. Another thing is that everyone knows about equivalence partitioning, of course, and this can help you again come back to the value types and see if it's going to be supported or if it's necessary in the first place. Decision tables or similar stuff is going to help you understand how the different rulings and different validations work. So the general idea is that your testing techniques, the ones that you use in daily practice, can also be applied to requirements analysis, even if you don't really know what else to do. Another thing is the dependencies. Sometimes, a lot of the times, people don't realize that requirements actually rely on other requirements to properly work. For example, if you have different applications, for example, a web application and a mobile application, we might want to know how one affects the other. For example, if I have a specific function like calculation in a web UI, a mobile specific state can interrupt this computation by a call, for example, which is not available in the web. So this might come in handy, knowing stuff like that. Another example is non-functional requirements. So for example, if we take load as one of them, high load creates latency, and of course latency can affect function, especially if we want to retrieve some kind of value from somewhere. This might become problematic. Now, I know it's been a lot of information, but it's going to come a bit even more difficult by just a pinch. We will take a look at a specific example because next we're going to talk about how to actually analyze requirements if you have subject matter expertise. I'm going to explain to you an example, and I hope it's easy to digest. I try to make it as simple as possible. So the situation is very simple. Person A wants to make a contract with person B to make some sort of transaction, like a trade. The condition is simple. If the price of some kind of good falls by a certain percentage in a 1 month time, the contract is going to be executed. Otherwise, only the fee is transferred at the end of the month. For those of you who know, this is just an example of an option, something that we work with in DevExperts on a daily basis. And for this, we have a simple requirements. A user should be able to execute the contract manually at any time. The contract should be automatically resolved after 1 month if no manual action is performed. If the contract is executed, we store the current price. And if it's dismissed, we send a message to the back office system. So this is kind of the situation that we're going to talk about and look into in the next techniques. And so if you have this kind of expertise, if you know and understand subject matter, you can probably start to digest specific processes and some sub-processes. One of the techniques is obviously visualization. It allows you to kind of create a simple diagram, architectural diagram of what you're going to test. And sometimes it helps you understand what exactly has been missed. For example, in this case, we want to store and retrieve, again, maybe price or some data for our computations, but we don't really know from where we're going to pull it, how we're going to pull it, how we're going to store it, where we're going to store it. Additionally, if we have some kind of validation for a 1 month time, we probably need some kind of timer, maybe, or something that is going to allow us to actually make the decision about whether I'm going to do it now or sometime later if I have still some time. So this is like an overview of a bigger picture. And the logical continuation of this is the state flow diagrams. These flowcharts allow you to try to digest sub-processes that happen inside the processes that we have talked about just a second ago. For example, if our statement is that after 1 month time has passed, we want to execute the contract. The requirement states that in case the contract is executed, we should store a price. But maybe we also want to send a message to the back office. It's not in any way highlighted in the requirements, but this kind of approach allows you to maybe ask a question that might potentially help you out in avoiding some problem later on. Another technique is gap analysis, and it's a bit of a more advanced technique, sort of. In this case, you kind of take the first state of the system and the final state of the system, and you try to understand what's going to happen in between those statements, between those states. I'm going to take a look at 2 examples. One is time. So for example, if you want to create a contract and it's going to be executed in 1 month time, we probably want to understand what is 1 month time specifically. Is it a hard-coded value like 30 days, or is it should it be dynamically changed depending on the month? Another thing is if one person sits in Portugal and another person sits in Japan, probably there's time difference between the 2 places. So time zones should also be covered in the requirements. Another thing is price. Price is always changing, but we want to store a specific price. It means that when we retrieve this price, it's probably subject to some kind of exception. So we need to know what we're going to do if there is a problem during saving of the price. Or if we store the price in the first place, it means that we do it for some specific reason, probably comparison. But if comparison is in place, why don't we store 2 prices, just 1 price? So this is another thing that we might consider. Risk analysis, honestly, it requires a presentation of its own. It's a huge topic, but I will just give you a glimpse into it and with some things that I consider the most kind of omitted most of the times. But risk analysis basically allows you to kind of predict what kind of potential problems you might encounter in the future and try to mitigate them with some decisions made before that. One of those risks areas is fallbacks. If you don't understand how your system is going to behave in an event of an exception, this might be a problem. So if there's a fail, we need to understand how to fall back from it, right, and recover. And actually, recovery is the next thing that we can also take a look at. If, for example, something doesn't go right and we cannot store a specific value, but it's not an exception, it still means that we still need to get this data and provide it to the user, especially, again, if it concerns money. So recovery and fallbacks are usually those areas that are usually omitted. So to sum up everything that has been said, the main benefit in reviewing requirements is the ability to align your understanding with the rest of the team. This is the most important, because if the whole team understands what they're doing, it's going to be easier for everyone and less of a pain. Organizational process is key for this process is transparency, so to say, and the ease of use. So however easy it is, the easier it is to use this process, the more likely people are going to actually use it and not omit it and not just kind of get rid of it altogether. If you're performing analysis with no experience, you probably want to keep in mind the context and try to approach the problem from different angles. And you want to mostly rely on formal criteria and your general knowledge about software development. But if you have some experience and if you have some subject matter expertise, you might want to start with visualization techniques that allow you to better understand the process and subsequently sub-processes. But again, don't forget about general experience and the ability to kind of use your head and general logic. Final point is the one that I already mentioned, is that clear enunciation of results is extremely important. If you come to a person and they ask you what you have done, the ability to say to them what you have done specifically is going to be a huge benefit, especially to you. Because if you see that something has been tested and you know what specifically has been done, you can probably start to think about what hasn't been done. And this allows you additional opportunity to find specific problems and requirements without executing any code whatsoever. And this is kind of it. Thank you for your attention.